Good afternoon, and welcome to the virtual Abraham Lincoln Institute Symposium hosted by Ford's Theater. My name is Jonathan White, and I'm chairman of the board of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. Normally, we meet at Ford's Theater every March to hear wonderful speakers talk about the life and legacy of our 16th president. This year, unfortunately, we had to cancel our annual symposium. But we are grateful to Ford's for offering to host a series of live webcasts with our speakers. We will be meeting here on the internet every other Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for the next few weeks to hear speakers that we were unable to see in person in March. I want to thank ALI President Ron Sudalter for making arrangements with our speakers and the team at Ford's Theater for making it all happen. In particular, I'd like to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Carolina Dulce, Gary Erskine, Juliana Avery, Colleen Pryor, and David McKenzie. Throughout the lecture, you can post questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. Our speaker will address them at the end of the lecture. On Twitter, please use the hashtag FordsALI. Our speaker today is Carl Guarneri. Dr. Guarneri is professor of history at St. Mary's College of California, where he has taught since 1979. He has published a number of books that pursue transnational approaches to the 19th century America, including America Compared and America in the World. Today, he will be speaking about his most recent book, Lincoln's Informer, Charles A. Dana and the Inside Story of the Union War, which was published by the University Press of Kansas in 2019. The review at Civil War News says, "Get yourself a copy, you will be glad you did." It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Carl Guarneri.
Thank you, John, and thanks to the ALI for inviting me to speak at this year's virtual symposium. I've titled my talk for today, Dana's Lincoln, a War Department insider's perspective on the Union president. On the night of May 4th, 1864, General Ulysses Grant's massive federal army lumbered across the Rapidan River to begin its climactic advance against Robert E. Lee's army defending Richmond. Back in Washington, 2 harrowing days passed without word from the front. When a congressman asked how Grant was faring, President Lincoln replied gamely, "Well, I can't tell much about it. You see, Grant has gone into the wilderness, crawled in, drawn up the ladder, and pulled in the hole after him. And I guess we'll have to wait till he comes out before we know just what he's up to." Tormented by the silence, Lincoln and War Secretary Edwin Stanton decided to send Stanton's trusted deputy, Charles A. Dana, to the front as their confidential reporter. This was not the first time that Lincoln and Stanton had sent Dana to the front. During the previous year, at Vicksburg, Chickamauga, and Chattanooga, Dana had reported privately to them about leading generals and the progress of their campaigns. Dana's sharp, no-nonsense observations informed Lincoln and Stanton on the state of the war and guided their military moves. Targets of Dana's criticism dismissed him as an administration spy, but Lincoln praised him as the eyes of the government at the front. These field reports later became Dana's claim to notice and notoriety among Civil War historians. But his desk job in Washington as Stanton's assistant secretary from January 1864 to July 1865 was also important. Between his embedding in military campaigns and his troubleshooting in Washington, few men had such a varied war career or such close relations with Union leaders, including President Lincoln. Today, I'd like to briefly survey Charles Dana's interactions with the wartime president to offer some highlights of Dana's Lincoln. One of my aims in writing Lincoln's Informer was that by casting a sideways light on key Civil War figures like Lincoln, Dana's story would help construct a dramatic, three-dimensional portrait of these leaders and their times. Dana's relations with Lincoln divided neatly into 3 stages. First, his editorial commentary on Lincoln as a candidate and first-year president. Second, his confidential association with Lincoln as Stanton's special agent and assistant secretary. And third, his post-war reminiscences of the slain Union hero. Taken in sequence, they suggest Dana's influence on the president and conversely, the profound impression Lincoln made upon him. The main trajectory of the relationship was a gradual convergence of views, emblematic of the growing accommodation between the president and radical Republicans. Historians used to stress Lincoln's raging quarrel with radical Republicans, but recently more have come to stress how as the war dragged on and a moderate policy failed to bring Union gains, Lincoln absorbed the views of radical Republicans on emancing Confederate slaves, adopting hard war tactics, and stiffening the requirements for Reconstruction. Charles Dana not only applauded this shift, he helped to bring it about. Dana pushed the president to promote fighting generals and replace timid ones, and he discouraged negotiating or trading with Confederates, and he called for harsh treatment of rebel leaders when the war was ending. In the interest of conserving time, I'll pass quickly over Dana's editorial commentary on Lincoln at the New York Tribune, which began by enthusiastically sizing up the surprise nominee after the 1860 convention, and then continued by praising Lincoln for his tough stand in refusing any compromise on extending slavery and tolerating secession. Dana's first face-to-face meeting came with Lincoln just after the inauguration, when a group of New York radicals visited the White House to present their list of hoped-for appointees. "One side shall not gobble up everything," Dana remembered Lincoln saying, and he appreciated that the president followed through by dividing the spoils quite evenly among warring party factions. As a writer of editorials, however, Dana quickly lost patience with the administration. One major issue was the slow pace of army movements on the Union's Virginia front. In June 1861, Dana bellowed on the Tribune's masthead, "Forward to Richmond," prodding Lincoln and the cabinet to order a movement on Manassas. The ensuing debacle at Bull Run was widely and incorrectly blamed on Greeley. Even Lincoln had asked the Tribune's Washington bureau chief, "What in the world's the matter with Uncle Horace? Why can't he restrain himself and wait a little?" Dana unrepentantly followed up with a call for General Scott and the entire cabinet to resign. A similar Dana outburst against the endless preparations of the Army of the Potomac under General McClellan led Greeley to fire Dana 8 months later. The Tribune could not be seen as leading the Union Army to disastrous defeat a second time. In tandem with Greeley, Dana had also pressured Lincoln to drop his hesitations about freeing and arming slaves. Dana insisted that the Confederate slaves should be declared free and enlisted as soldiers. On a trip down the Mississippi, he sounded out Western officers about emancipation, and he forwarded their strong support to Lincoln. A few months later, Lincoln's crony Leonard Swett visited the White House, where the president was issuing the proclamation. Lincoln reached for his desk and showed Swett, quote, "a dozen or more letters from Dana of the Tribune, lamenting that the administration was doing little to end slavery and press the military and letting the country go to the dogs." These were most likely letters Dana had penned to the ambitious new War Secretary, Edwin Stanton. Sharing Dana's impatience, Stanton appointed him his troubleshooter to promote what both men called war in earnest. In one stroke, the gadfly journalist became an administration insider. At the War Department, Dana's best known and most controversial role was serving as Lincoln's eyes and ears at the front. After General Grant's various stratagems failed to threaten the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Lincoln and Stanton dispatched Dana to Grant's headquarters to keep them informed and address rumors about his alleged incompetence and drunkenness. Grant was famously a meager writer and telegrapher, as Lincoln called him, and Dana's crisp reports daily filled the void. Grant and his staff took the administration's spy into their confidence and they won him over. Dana accompanied Grant's army on its bold move past Vicksburg's batteries, then rapidly eastward across the Mississippi to approach Vicksburg by its landward side. As Grant's army settled down to a siege, Dana made three important interventions with the president. First, he obtained Lincoln's permission for Grant to relieve General John McClernand. This was no easy task because Lincoln had appointed the Illinoisian McClernand as a political general. Second, after Dana joined Grant on a riverboat inspection tour during which the general got stupidly drunk, Dana's telegrams covered up the episode. Only when Dana returned to Washington did he confide the story to Lincoln, assuring the president that it was an isolated incident. This was when Lincoln made his famous quip about distributing Grant's whiskey to his other generals. Finally, Dana reassured Lincoln that Grant was fully cooperating with the administration's policy of recruiting former slaves. Grant had initially opposed this policy, but Dana's advice played a large role in turning him around. Thanks to these assurances, and of course, military victories from Grant, Lincoln declared, "Grant is my man, and I am his for the rest of the war." A similar story played out in May 1864 when Lincoln asked Dana to reprise his role as confidential reporter during Grant's overland campaign against Lee's army in Virginia. Again, Dana accompanied Grant's men on the move, filing eyewitness battle descriptions and relaying Grant's tactics to Washington. Despite 6 weeks of near constant fighting and horrific casualty counts, Dana's dispatches assured the president that Union victory was not far off. "It's a mere question of time and patience," he wrote. Once or twice a day, Lincoln walked over to the War Department to read Dana's dispatches. The president showed them to White House visitors, shared them at cabinet meetings. Dana's daily updates conveyed Grant's determination to wear down Lee's army, even in the face of the Virginia campaign's waning momentum and staggering casualty lists. General Rosecrans was a different matter. Dana had heard criticism before joining the general at Chattanooga in September 1863, but he did not set out to get Rosecrans sacked. He praised the general's brilliant maneuvering against Braxton Bragg in Tennessee, and he vouched for the general's behavior during the panicked Union retreat at Chickamauga, which Dana saw firsthand and which he compared to Bull Run in a telegram sent to Washington. Only after that, when Rosecrans proved unfocused and irresolute as the Confederates tried to starve out the Army of the Cumberland at Chattanooga, did Dana advise his replacement. Lincoln, paraphrasing Dana, admitted that Rosecrans seemed confused and stunned, like a duck hit on the head. But for political and personal reasons, the president delayed taking action, hoping that Rosecrans would rally. Only when Dana's long dispatches ruthfully criticizing or commending our generals were being deciphered, a telegraph operator recalled, Lincoln would usually read them aloud with running comments, harsh criticisms being softened along the way. Here was a classic contrast between the tender-hearted president and his hard-nosed reporter, much like the war-long tug between Lincoln and Stanton. Gradually, Lincoln's alarming telegrams, matched by gloomy ones from Rosecrans himself, convinced Lincoln that the general had to go. Lincoln never adopted Dana's ruthless, regretless view of the war, but the Rosecrans episode drew him a bit closer. This was a good thing. Despite Rosecrans' defenders, it's clear from Grant's ensuing spectacular success in the battles for Chattanooga that Dana made the right call. Once installed at his desk in Washington, Dana transmitted correspondence and political scuttlebutt to the White House and also performed small favors for the president. "Will Mr. Dana please see and hear this man and do the best for him he can, Lincoln scribbled on a typical note. The president had visited a wounded soldier at a DC hospital and promised to give an appointment to him if he recovered. Dana found him a job as a payroll clerk. Requests like these multiplied as Dana experienced firsthand the president's legendary compassion. At one point, Lincoln's friend Joshua Speed sat in the president's office amid a throng of petitioners. All had been seen, but then Lincoln turned to two plainly dressed women, the wife and mother of a young man from Western Pennsylvania who had been arrested for resisting the draft. They had no written petition because they couldn't write or afford an attorney. Taking pity, Lincoln sent a messenger to Dana requesting a list of all draft resistors imprisoned in the region. When Dana arrived, Dana told him that he knew of no serious criminals in the group, and Lincoln said, "Well then, these fellows have suffered long enough. Now my mind is on the subject. I think I'll turn out the whole flock." He had Dana draw up an order releasing all the men and signed it. In these and other cases, the compassion of the partner-in-chief tested the patience of more severe-minded officials, including Dana. General Augur, the commander at Washington, once asked Dana to sign a hasty death warrant for a convicted spy. The man was to be executed the next morning, and Lincoln would be out of town until the afternoon. Dana agreed the spy should be made an example and signed the order. The next morning, Dana encountered the general, who told him that Lincoln had returned at 2 a.m. and stopped it all. There were other times, however, when Dana and Lincoln worked hand in glove. After he was elected to a second term, Lincoln enlisted Dana's assistance in lobbying for the 13th Amendment to pass it through the House of Representatives. This was the secret campaign that was at the heart of Steven Spielberg's fine movie Lincoln of 2012, which, despite its large cast of characters, did not see fit to include Charles Dana. The president stopped by Dana's office and asked him to meet with 3 House Democrats to discuss patronage promises. 2 from New York agreed to accept Custom House's appointments in exchange for their votes, and a 3rd from New Jersey was evidently persuaded to absent himself from the vote. At the end of January, the amendment passed the House with 2 votes to spare. Lincoln's indirect bargaining helped to tip the balance, and Dana relished the part he had played. Lincoln's political judgment was not infallible, however. Other backroom deals the president orchestrated were more productive of mischief than good. A case in point was his approval of the cotton for supplies trade with Confederates in the last year of the war. Lobbied heavily by Northern businessmen, Lincoln convinced himself that allowing Southern cotton to be exchanged between the lines, even for food and other materials valuable to the Confederate Army, would help Northern mill owners and prevent European arms merchants from aiding the rebels. The president privately signed cotton trading permits as favors to dozens of Republican allies and cronies. "If pecuniary greed can be made to aid us in such an effort," Lincoln wrote a critic, "let us be thankful that so much good can be got out of pecuniary greed." This is not the sort of noble sentiment that later got carved on the Lincoln Memorial. In December 1864, the press broke the story. At the War Department, Stanton and Dana, fierce opponents of the contraband trade, schemed covertly to end it by having General Grant order a military investigation of the trade in Virginia. Meanwhile, Dana and his detective Lafayette Baker testified before Congress that Confederate agents in Canada had arranged with Northern speculators for massive exchanges of cotton for pork, with the administration's apparent approval. Outraged by these exposures, Congress passed a law that halted the exchange of cotton for supplies. Lincoln killed the bill by not signing it, a pocket veto. Dana and Stanton, however, did an end run around the president. After receiving the War Department's report, Grant issued a special order voiding all trade permits, including those signed by the president. The exchange of cotton for food was finally stopped, but only 1 month before Grant's army effectively ended the war. Looking back on the episode, Dana lamented that Mr. Lincoln had a vast number of friends who were bent upon making money in various ways, and he was much more willing than I could have wished. The administration's toleration of illicit trade set a damaging precedent and left a regrettable blot on Lincoln's war record. When the Confederates abandoned Richmond in April 1865, Stanton sent Dana to keep him apprised. Lincoln, who was on the scene, needed to be watched, not only because he might expose himself to danger, but also because he might offer a quick and too lenient peace to Virginia's crushed Confederates. In effect, Dana was to serve as Stanton's eyes on Lincoln. The president, in fact, had already opened talks with Confederate officials in Richmond, and he was on the verge of making a dangerous concession, allowing the state's rebel legislature to meet and vote to withdraw the state from the CSA. After Lincoln returned to Washington, and even after Lee's surrender, he continued to contemplate this as the best transition to peace. Only after Lincoln read Dana's alarming report from Richmond that the Virginia lawmakers planned to haggle about loyalty oaths, representation in Congress, and slavery did Lincoln call off the negotiations. Thanks to Stanton and Dana, Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction toughened, and Stanton was delegated to draw up a plan for temporary military occupation. Even then, Lincoln didn't drop his conciliatory posture. Just a few hours before the president's assassination, Dana was sent to the Oval Office to have Lincoln approve the arrest of Jacob Thompson, the Confederates' dirty trick mastermind in Canada, who allegedly was passing through Maine on his way to England. Well, no, Lincoln mused. When you've got an elephant by the hind leg and he's trying to run away, it's best to let him go. Oh, stuff, Stanton supposedly responded when Dana reported back, although his words were surely stronger than that. Literally to his dying day, Lincoln preached malice toward none and never fully accepted Dana and Stanton's vindictive, no-holds-barred approach to pro-Confederate Northerners, rebel agents, or Confederate leaders. In the post-war era, Dana's view of Lincoln softened into consistent admiration. The great quality of Lincoln's appearance was benevolence, the wish to do somebody good if he could, Dana recalled. The president's humor delighted him. You never saw him, but he'd come up and put his arm through yours and go on telling a joke. Lincoln's stories and jokes, never unkind, were a salve for the natural gloom of a melancholy and desponding temperament, Dana wrote. Eventually, Dana came to appreciate Lincoln as a realist, not quite his own hard-boiled version of one, but perhaps more effective because of his empathy and flexibility. Beneath Lincoln's kindly demeanor lay a solid, keen, hard intelligence, Dana wrote, one that saw all sides of a question, then chose the best option, even if it meant abandoning a prior position. As the war dragged on, Lincoln had moved closer to Dana and the Republican radicals' tougher positions on waging it and ending slavery once for all. Meanwhile, once Dana entered the administration, he developed a stronger sense of the political constraints impinging on the president's decision-making. The result was a convergence of views, very much like what happened between Lincoln and congressional radicals, but in Dana's case, there was also a belated recognition that clear-eyed realism, tempered by compassion, was at the core of Lincoln's greatness. By the 1890s, Dana's wartime impatience had long worn off, and Lincoln had ascended to his secure perch at the height of the American political pantheon. These changes swept aside Dana's earlier criticisms. In his memory, Lincoln was not the slow-moving president he had berated in the Tribune for not forcing McClellan to attack or for temporizing on emancipation, nor was he the tender-hearted commander-in-chief Dana and his boss Stanton had pushed into crackdowns on copperheads, cotton traders and rebel negotiators. As so many recent studies of Civil War memory have reminded us, remembering can also involve strategic forgetting. In the elder Dana's telling, Lincoln was an unparalleled master of military strategy and political calculation. He hired and fired generals with unfailing wisdom, timed the Emancipation Proclamation exactly right, balanced his party's factions deftly, and effortlessly orchestrated balky cabinet members into agreement. While disposing of one romanticized version of the martyred president, Lincoln as secular saint, Dana's reminiscences contributed to the making of another legend, Lincoln as the infallible mastermind of Union victory. If this assessment sometimes contravened the actual wartime record, and if it reversed some of Dana's earlier views, it represented a reassessment of Lincoln in light of the Union's successful restoration. As a colleague wrote at the time, no doubt Dana knew Lincoln had not been right in all things, but having achieved the greatest work in the history of the nation, he was above the reach of criticism. Viewed this way, Dana's unqualified post-war praise for Lincoln was a fitting tribute to the president's pivotal role in saving the nation and ending the scourge of slavery through Union victory in the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. That was wonderful. We have some questions that we've received from viewers. The first one is, why did Lincoln feel the need for Dana to serve as an intermediary between Grant and Lincoln?
That's a good question. By this point in the war, and we're talking about spring of 1863, I think Lincoln and Stanton had, first of all, realized that some generals wrote them too often and some not enough. And Grant was definitely in the second category. He kept them on a one-a-day diet, sometimes a once-a-week diet with his telegrams. The second thing is that many generals, and Rosecrans was one, certainly McClellan was another, constantly asked for reinforcements, magnified their victories beyond the truth, glorified their soldiers and campaigns in a way that drew skepticism, I think, from Washington leaders, and they needed a more independent assessment from somebody who did not have skin in the game, someone who was not a military ally, a fellow West Pointer, but someone who would give them, as best he could, the straight facts.
Interesting. The next question is, was Lincoln confident that Dana's reports to him were factual and pure reporting, or was he ever concerned about bias or embellishment in Dana's reports, or that Dana was pushing an agenda? I think, generally speaking, Lincoln had a great deal of confidence in Dana's reports because they were vivid and factual. They condensed a lot of action into short paragraphs and were extremely useful that way. When Dana started to give assessments of generals or officers in his telegrams, Stanton at first admonished him not to, saying he had gone beyond his charge. But gradually, they came to trust, both Stanton and Lincoln came to trust his judgment, and he crept more and more of those judgments with evidence into his telegrams, to the point where they considered him an extremely reliable reporter, and even asked him, for instance, at the end of the Vicksburg campaign, to send them letters assessing Grant's staff, generals, and their officers. And he wrote 3 letters that never did get printed in the official Union records because they were so frank, and included some profanity as well, in which he assessed like over 80 different Union officers in very frank terms, sorting them into positive and negative categories, as if he was setting type for the New York Tribune newspaper. Do you recall any gems from those letters in terms of his assessments? I often think of how John Adams was famous for assessing people in very frank and candid ways. Does anything come to mind from Dana's?
Well, he definitely called a couple of leading generals asses and useless fellows. One of general on Jeremiah on Grant's staff, Jeremiah Sullivan, had recently been sent over there, and Dana said he'd been doing nothing with about as much effect as he would do anywhere else in the Army. This one particularly stuck with me because I discovered that General Sullivan is buried about a mile from my house. I kind of literally stumbled on his grave in Mountain View Cemetery here in Oakland.
Oh, wow. Another viewer asked if you could talk a little bit about Dana's post-war life.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Another viewer asked if you could talk a little bit about Dana's post-war life.
Ah, yes. In some way, there were two Danas, and this is one of the mysteries of the man, because before the war, he was a rabid anti-slavery activist. He had reported for the Tribune on the 1848 revolutions in Europe very positively. And during the war, he advocated very much as a champion for emancipation. Immediately after the war, he started a paper in Chicago with radical Republican views, where he pushed very hard against President Andrew Johnson for the radical Reconstruction agenda. But then after he supported Grant for president in 1868, but he broke with him pretty fiercely over corruption in the administration, which was always a hot button for Dana. And little by little, he moved toward the Democratic Party. He figured that once the 15th Amendment was passed, African Americans were on their own, and it was up to them to achieve equality. And he became a Democrat and a curmudgeon, really, in his last 30 years, during which he was editor of a very successful paper in New York, the New York Sun.
One viewer asked, how, Charles Dana is not a household name. How did you get onto this project? Well,
my very first book, almost 30 years ago, was on utopian communities before the Civil War. And Dana was associated with and a member of Brook Farm Community, famous transcendentalist enclave outside Boston. That's where I found out about him. But then I realized he had a really interesting career after that. And I decided to follow it up. A lot of books and other research projects intervened. But when I finally did the research on it, I realized that I could use him as a kind of vehicle, a kind of window, not only on Lincoln and Stanton, but really on the whole Union War. Also, I had to get around an existing source, and that was the recollections of the Civil War that supposedly Dana wrote just before his death, and they were actually ghostwritten by the muckraker Ida Tarbell for McClure's magazine. And Dana did not write a word of them. He only lived to read to proofread or check about 10% of it. And they're full of errors and interpretations that Tarbell stuck in, documents that are misquoted or misinterpreted. So I had to work around, I had to kind of deconstruct that source to see what was still valuable in it and what wasn't. I didn't make my book a running commentary on this so-called memoir, but if you read the footnotes, you will see lots of corrections of it.
Sure. Good. One viewer asked and said, you mentioned in your book that Dana used a transposition cipher to communicate with Lincoln and Stanton. And the question is, were all the telegrams sent in code?
All the ones that I'm familiar with were sent in code. Yeah, it was a simple code, though, but somehow it seems that the Confederates never got hold of it or pardon the pun, cottoned to it. it involved basically word scrambling into different columns that then got rearranged when you read it, and a book of code words that changed every few months for proper names, places, people, battles, etc. The only time Dana's telegram, he claimed, got deciphered before it reached Washington was the momentous telegram he sent from the Battle of Chickamauga, saying my report today is of urgent importance. Chickamauga is as fatal a name as Bull Run, etc. A Union telegraph operator in Louisville deciphered it, sent it to the Associated Press, and word got out immediately that the Union had suffered this terrible defeat at Chickamauga. Not as terrible as Dana's initial telegram. After all, he was driven right from the field himself, but he was very angry about that and urged Stanton to punish whoever was responsible.
One viewer said that they saw a plaque honoring Dana in Cuba and wondered what Dana did with respect to Cuba.
Dana had, after the Civil War, the liberation of Cuba, the independence of Cuba, and the end of slavery there, became one of his pet causes. And in his newspaper, the New York Sun, he promoted it tirelessly. And he believed that the United States should intervene. At several points, he advocated for the United States to intervene in order to help Cuba achieve its independence. There's a Civil War angle to this too, because Dana got involved very late in his life in these annual blue and gray reunions, these reconciliationist reunions between Union and Confederate veterans. And his argument was that we needed to unite the country because we've got this foreign war approaching with Spain that is going to liberate Cuba. And it's important for us to shake hands now and forget the Civil War, so we'll be united for this attempt to liberate Cuba.
The last question says this: is it unusual that Lincoln and Stanton would have so much confidence in Dana as a former reporter to be qualified to assess military command and tactics?
I think it was. Remember that Dana was well educated. He went to Harvard. He had pored over military textbooks and histories. In fact, he peppered his telegrams with all kinds of references to Napoleon's campaign, totally befuddling the telegraph operators on the other end who were trying to decipher them. And for at least a year, he had managed the Tribune's band of the so-called Bohemian Brigade, the reporters who went out, the special correspondents who went out to report on the battles. He received their reports, he edited them into coherent battle narratives, and along the way, he gained a fair amount of expertise along that line. Once he got to Grant's headquarters, he quickly befriended James Wilson, Grant's chief engineer, who took him around and showed him the ins and outs of fortifications and all that. So in a sense, and also Sherman took him under his wing, a big talker that he was. And so he was definitely sort of groomed for this by his 1 year's worth of reporting and then his sort of apprenticeship in Grant's headquarters, to the point where they came very much to trust him.
Well, we are just about out of time. Thank you, Carl, for your remarks. Thank you, those of you who are watching at home, for joining us. We are grateful to our speaker and to Fords for hosting this wonderful event. We will meet again in 2 weeks at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on June 22nd to hear Joseph Fry speak about his new book, Lincoln, Seward, and U.S. Foreign Relations in the Civil War Era. Until then, please stay safe and keep reading good books about Abraham Lincoln.